Welcome to the RCRM Speaker Series Season 2. My name is Dr. Georgiana Stanciu, and I'm happy to welcome everyone on our YouTube channel. Season 2 of the RCRM Speaker Series will explore various aspects of loss in the context of military conflict. When this topic attracts scholarly attention, the unthinkable is often revealed. Complex facets of the dynamic between mourning and commemoration, deprivation and rejection, or disposal of war byproducts surface. All of it leaves undeniable traces on the communities found in the path of the clash. Our series will run this year in two parts, from January to June, and after a 2-month summer break, from September to November 2021. Each talk will be premiered on the museum YouTube channel, followed by a podcast episode released 3 weeks after. Follow our social media for schedule and updates. The first speaker is Professor Gordon Heath, Professor of Christian History and Centenary Chair in World Christianity at McMaster Divinity College in Hamilton, Ontario. Among his published titles are Doing Church History, a user-friendly introduction to researching the history of Christianity, and A War with a Silver Lining, Canadian Protestant Churches and the South African War, 1899-1902. Professor Heath has already contributed to the RCRM Speaker Series during Season 1, and on behalf of the museum, I would like to extend our thanks for helping us to launch Season 2. Today, Professor Heath will talk about the trauma of war and the rise of religious pacifism in Interwar Years 1919-1939. This presentation explores the trajectory and motives for the shift in the Church's discourse between the two world wars. The presentation demonstrates that the shift in perspective was a result of a number of influences, a primary one being the unprecedented and traumatic losses experienced during the Great War. The familiar rhetoric of war simply could not stand in face of such losses.
Welcome to the presentation entitled The Trauma of War and the Rise of Religious Pacifism in the Interwar Years, 1919-1939. And my name is Gordon Heath, and I'm Professor of Christian History at McMaster Divinity College. In the fall of 1914, nearly all of Canada was passionate about supporting the war effort. Of course, not everyone was, but the vast majority of people were. Following a pattern and precedent established during the South African War just a decade earlier, most Canadian churches responded enthusiastically to the national cause as well. And if you are interested in looking at the Canadian churches in the First World War, there are a number of different works you can look at. One is an edited volume that I put together a number of years ago entitled Canadian Churches and the First World War. You can also look at Mark McGowan's The Imperial Irish, and it examines the English Catholics of Canada. And you can also look at Melissa Davidson's recently completed PhD dissertation that looks at Canadian Protestants and Catholics. And so those are some sources to get into the Canadian churches in the First World War. If you look at the PowerPoint slide, you can see a statement there that summarizes well the confidence that was there in the churches in the First World War. I am so sure that God means well for our cause, as any Hebrew prophet was sure of the divine mission of ancient Israel. And my reason for quoting that is because it just gives a real sense of the confidence. But note that confidence in the cause and confidence in the way in which the churches would go about supporting the war would be severely criticized and undermined and challenged in the 1920s and 1930s. So before I launch into looking at the interwar period, just a couple comments on the terms pacifist, pacifism, and so on and so forth. A word on pacifism is in order. As Thomas Saucknett notes, Canadian pacifism was a widely diverse movement. There's no one type of pacifist. Religious, secular motivations are all kinds. There was also a spectrum of Christian opinion, from sectarian pacifists, such as historic peace churches, to liberal reform pacifists who were elated with international developments for peace, but at the end of the day were willing to use force as a last resort. So to distinguish between the two types of pacifist, you'll hear me sometimes say absolute pacifists who are opposed to war in all cases, and then internationalist pacifists or pro-international organization pacifists or anti-war pacifists. And these are pacifists who are elated with the move away from war, but when push comes to shove, would be willing to go to war, but they don't really want to for a number of reasons. The problem in trying to figure out what type of pacifist is being talked about, or is actually talking, the kind of quotes that we will read, is that both types of pacifists use the same rhetoric. And so that complicates the process of identifying which type of pacifism was being exhibited. A couple words on the religious press. This presentation explores the range of views among the United Church, beginning with Methodists, but then they disappear, they collapse into the United Church, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Baptists, which would be close to 90% of all Protestants in Canada. And I'm primarily looking at it through the religious press, their views through the religious press. The press played a number of unique roles in the life of the churches, providing news and devotional material for the faithful. Very extensive press, not like today. These are actual newspapers, weekly newspapers, some with incredible circulation, rivaling secular papers. So a couple things to note. One, it's difficult to know just how representative the papers were when it came to views in the pews or in the pulpits for that matter. But what is certain is that these papers embraced their role as nation builder, as did the denominations, and they sought to shape readers' views of events, to inform and motivate Christian engagement on pressing issues. Another thing to note is, in regards to these papers, is how trauma studies can provide some insight into the role that the religious press played in helping their readers deal with post-war cultural trauma. Jeffrey Alexander argues that cultural trauma, quote, occurs when members of a collectivity feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. Well, that description fits the post-war context. Jonathan Vance has noted how post-war churches shifted from providing wartime motivation to post-war consolation, and religious services and memorials contributed to the construction of memory, meaning, and myth that provided comfort for the grieving. The religious press, I argue, with its various genres, multiple views, and symbol making, contributed to this process of recovery of the trauma of the war by acting as a survival manual and by naming and interpreting and explaining events. And by doing so, it helped to reorient people traumatized by the horrors of war. The range of perspectives and various genres in the press functioned, whether intentionally or not, as a text rebuilding a canopy of meaning, someone else's expression, not mine, in an age that had its meaning shattered by the horrors of war. Its wide-ranging poems, sermons, letters to editors, devotionals, editorials, reports on official proceedings, and political commentary provided a way for the churches to face and ultimately come to grips with the cultural trauma of the worst war up to that time in human history. But also, the press, ironically and unwittingly, prepared the churches for the next catastrophe. There was enormous complexity. Now moving away from definitions of pacifism and talking about the press, we simply have to note right off the top, there's enormous complexity with the church's relationship with armed conflict. And here I am, that quote comes from Tom Lawson and Stephen Parker. That complexity was on full display in the interwar years, and the pages of the religious press reveal a conflicted church. There's no one view in the press in the 20-year interwar period. There's no one view in the pages of the religious press. There's a wide range. On the one hand, support was expressed for just war tradition and the support for the First World War, the historic connection to state, love of monarchy, loyal to nation, devotion to empire was also deeply embedded within the identity of the churches, which led to a rejection of much of the pacifist impulse. On the other hand, there was initially a deep disappointment with the outcome of the war to end all wars that led to disillusionment with war. Fear of the next war, in combination with optimism over the outlawing of war through international organizations such as the League of Nations and treaties such as the Pact of Paris, led to a surging pacifism that believed a new world of peace where war was outlawed was indeed possible in their lifetime. As war with Nazi Germany loomed, however, and the rise of Japanese fascism, Italian fascism, the differences among pacifism became more apparent with every German annexation and Italian annexation and Japanese advance in China and Asia. The virtual public unanimity of church support in the fall of 1913 for the war against Hitler reveals a loyalty to tradition and historic identity that had remained steadfast, and the anti-war voices were primarily of the internationalist pacifist sort. However, we'll get to the end of the war. At the end of this discussion, there was a significant exception to this in the United Church, but we'll talk about that. But that interwar surge of pacifism still left its mark on the church, for the just war position of the church had been winnowed and reformed, leading to a sober support for the Second World War without the jingoistic excesses of the Great War. So those are my opening comments. Now I just want to run through these points: optimism and hope. There had never before been a bloodbath like the First World War. The overall cost of human life was staggering. 65 million people mobilized, 21 million wounded, over 8 million dead. The rates of death for the entire war averaged 6,000 deaths a day. Those overall numbers don't even include the genocide of Armenians by the Turks, or the tens of millions who died in the post-war Spanish influenza. So devastating. Canada sent over 600,000 troops, roughly 8% of the population, and experienced roughly 60,000 dead and 173,000 wounded. However, the horrendous losses of the Great War could be justified, it was thought, or at least felt, if the end result was a world without war. Not surprisingly then, the sorry state of the post-war world led to various expressions of disappointment and alarm. One commentator bemoaned that manifestly there's a fight ahead for the Knights of the Prince of Peace. Yet another decried that the war clouds are hanging threateningly over the old world as we go to press forward. And so optimism that those incredible sacrifices of the First World War would somehow lead to a post-war world of peace. And there's questions about that in the years immediately following the war, because of course, as you know, the end of the First World War didn't mean the end of war in Europe. You have the revolution in Russia continuing, you've got Russian-Polish conflict, you've got conflicts all over, and so there's optimism, but then that optimism is quickly eroded. But then there's a surge of optimism in the mid-20s. By the mid-20s, that landscape had changed enough that it looked as if the long-anticipated peace was finally dawning. And so you have what's published as a creed for believers in a warless world, and you see this in a number of places. And it was issued by the Commission on International Justice and Goodwill of the Federal Council of the Churches of Christ in America. So it's an American document, but it this quickly circulates in Canada in the press. And so here you have a summary of it on your PowerPoint slide, and it's echoing this language of Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet. We believe in a sweeping reduction of armaments. We believe in international law, courts of justice, boards of arbitration, Association of Nations for World Peace. We believe in equality of race treatment. We believe that Christian patriotism demands a practice of goodwill, and so on and so forth. We believe that the spirit of Christian brotherhood can conquer every barrier of trade, color, creed, and race. And finally, we believe in a warless world and dedicate ourselves to its achievement. In Britain, there was widespread discontent among churches over their unabashed support for the Great War. And in the 1920s, religious discourse mirrored much of the anti-war zeitgeist, whether secular or religious in origin. By the end of the 20s, the spirit of bestsellers like All Quiet on the Western Front, Goodbye to All That, is widespread. And you see in this creed for a warless world a similar kind of shifting, a desire for peace, a growing pacifist movement in the States, in Britain, and in Canada. Optimism was palpable by mid to late 20s. It seemed a perfect storm of events had developed that gave hope to those longing and advocating for a warless world. Perhaps the war to end all wars would finally live up to its promise and be worthy of the cost. Many church commentators on War and Peace in the 20s were acutely aware of the complex issues related to the origins of armed conflict, and there were a flood of articles in the denominational literature in the 20s that questioned or outright rejected traditional notions of a just war and embraced pacifism, motivated by a number of factors. One, the influence of social gospel motifs, and the experience of the First World War being two most significant ones. Views were in flux, and the just war tradition was increasingly questioned. And those causes of war were quite similar to the ones noted in The Christian in War and Appeal. It's a book published in 1926 in Canada by a group of Montreal clergymen. And so you see over and over again a questioning of support for war, support for the notion of a just war, and even questioning the support for the war in the First World War. So you'll have articles. Here's just an example. So you have articles such as The Christian Attitude to War in 1926. Ross Eaton respond with the Christian attitude towards the war. And then Kierstead responding, what is the Christian attitude to war? So there's going back and forth, people questioning. But the weight of argument, the number of arguments away from the traditional understanding of the just war, it was very significant. And so here you'll have Ross Eaton, The Christian Attitude Towards the War Situation. And so I'm reading, no, there are some of us to whom any course but an out-and-out repudiation of the whole war system is but weak compromise that only plays into the hands of our militarists and warlords. Call us dreamers, idealists, weaklings, pacifists, what you will. We are through with war. Now remember, this is not an outlier. This type of discourse is not an outlier. This is widespread in the churches. And then we will see that in the 30s, this will actually get embedded in official statements of the denominations. I go on reading Eaton. What the future holds in store, we know not. But today, in faith, we take our stand with him whose sword was love and whose whole defense was truth. He was a martyred failure to his day and people, but today he looks back in living pity over the dead ruins of the empires of the past. Centuries hence, long after our massive military organizations have destroyed themselves, his truth will stand. And so Eaton will publish these kinds of statements, and there'll be counter responses. But again, this kind of discourse is widespread. War is the colossal curse of civilization, Eaton goes on to say. It's the arch crime of a demonized, demented humanity, social insanity resulting in social suicide, so on and so forth. Barbaric elemental passions of the race are expressed in it. It's brutality brought forward from the jungle. Again, this is the kind of rhetoric coming from church clergymen, and so it's expressed quite widely. Well, what's leading to this? Well, again, there's the social gospel language of the brotherhood of man, the love for those of other races, other peoples, other creeds, but also a revulsion of the war and the cost of the First World War. But there's some other factors that are taking place. Two historical events that directly contributed to the growing optimism: the birth of the League of Nations and the rise of disarmament conferences. A primary cause for growing optimism in the 20s was the birth of the League of Nations, with one commenter bemoaning that if there had been such a league in 1914, we suspect that even Germany, with all her preparation, would hardly have dared to declare war. So lots of optimism. Methodist clergyman Samuel Chown called it the most outstanding political achievement related to the kingdom of God that the world has ever seen. Others extolled the League and hoped that it would bring order and peace to the international order. Churches were exhorted to be a powerful ally of the League, and churches were encouraged to create campaigns to support the League. Preachers preached on it, people prayed for it, and so on and so forth. Look at the PowerPoint slide. This is just about the most practical piece of machinery that has yet been devised to implement international agreement. Now, the churches, even before the First World War, even before the Boer War, had talked about international arbitration as a way forward. Now they have an organization to bring this about. And so there's incredible optimism that this will bring about the peace that they're longing for, but the disarmament conferences as well. Concomitant with the maturation of the League of Nations were positive developments moving nations towards disarmament and the outlawing of war. By the mid-20s, growing optimism about the future was evident due to certain international developments. The Washington Conference, the Locarno Treaty, gave a degree of optimism for the end of the militarism that characterized the Great War, and subsequent years seemed to be within reach. The most hope was generated by the Pact of Paris, or the Kellogg-Briand Peace Treaty of 1928, where signatories declared that they would not use war as a means to settle disputes. Nations saying, we're done with using war. And so incredible optimism in the discourse during this time among the churches is very optimistic. And so the Spirit of God, quote, was seen to be at work in such developments. And in order for the work of disarmament conferences to be successful, it was argued that the church needed to marshal its resources to ensure their triumph. With that aim in mind, it offered prayers, services, and resources in support of the League and conferences. And so that just leads to the next slide, the role of churches. It's argued that the churches, in order to bring about this peace, must do something to ensure the League of Nations is successful, to ensure the various peace treaties are successful. And so churches launch crusades. They use that language, crusades to Christianize international relations. They feel that the structure's in place, but what's needed is the right spirit, a spirit of forgiveness, of love, of grace, of recognizing the brotherhood of man. And so the role of the church was to help create conditions for peace. Do you realize, here I'm reading from a message from Anglican bishops, do you realize that the Church of Christ has come to a great crisis in her history, that the world's future depends very largely upon the course the church adopts today, and that the day of opportunity is slipping away, nay, hurrying by? Let us not for a single moment imagine that we were fighting Germany and her allies alone. Behind and within them was the dominating spirit of pagan lust and greed. Have we mastered it and cast it out? If not, our victory is no true victory. In other words, the structures are in place, but you're not just fighting nations. In order for there to be peace, you need more than just structures. You need a spirit that makes these structures alive and vital and vibrant and successful. And who can do that but the churches? The churches can create a love of neighbor, a love of those in other nations who differ in creed and in belief, and so on and so forth. So you have conflicting commentary. There's simply no one type of narrative. Note that there is a movement definitely away from the language of the First World War. That language is pretty much jettisoned. Again, there's no uniform response to the rise of pacifism in those years, but there's certainly a rise of disgust and disillusionment with war. That's palpable. Unbridled nationalism is seen as a curse. And there's a fear that the growing nationalism in Canada, blossoming due to the nation's success in the First World War, could easily, quote, become a flower with dangerous poisons, concealed within its apparent loveliness. War was considered a horrendous nightmare, a futile endeavor. The costs of war were evident, making the waging of war a folly. And so all kinds of critical commentary. Here on your PowerPoint slide, you can see two types of commentary. The out-and-out pacifist was generally a rather naive and ill-informed person. Okay, so that's one perspective. Another perspective, the hope for a warless world, or the hope of a warless world. To save the women and babies of London, English airmen must kill women and babies in Berlin or Paris. As the New Statement puts it, to save Westminster Abbey, we must destroy Notre Dame. With all our modern engines of torture and death, are we any more chivalrous than these ignorant and barbarous tribes of a bygone age? Arguing that the next war, and war now, but the next war will be horrendous. And the waging of war, the waging of a modern war cannot be escaped. There's no way to escape the injustice of a modern war. And so the commentary is based on the costs of war, the commentary towards pacifism, the cost of war, the excess of war, the violence of war, the hatred of war, the way in which war is now fought. You have the fear of the next war. Listen to this quote. In our age of scientific cunning, we have invented the poisonous gas that sweeps upon an army stealthily with its deadly breath. We have the birds of prey that swoop down with their missiles of death upon sleeping babies and helpless women and old men. We have the terrible engines of destruction that blast an undefended city from its invisible obscurity. Gas bombs and disease germs to wipe out total areas of population are not only being contemplated, but actually prepared for the dread day. And so the fear of the next war, it's not only possible, it's not only possible for there to be a warless world because of these organizations. It's absolutely essential because the next war will be a war of gas attacks from the air and all kinds of horrors being rained down on cities. And so, as an aside, sometimes we don't understand appeasement. We often talk about Neville Chamberlain and appeasement and why were Western nations so unwilling to go to war with Germany? It's because this is part of it. There's a fear that the next war will be infinitely worse than the First World War. The gas used on the battlefield of the First World War will be used on cities in the Second World War. And so the next war is cast in these apocalyptic ways. And so war must be stopped. There cannot be the next war because it will be the end of Western civilization. And so all kinds of commentary about the next war. And so there's conflicting commentary. Not everyone is opposed to the notion of a just war, but the discourse is certainly it certainly leans towards the fear of the next war and the need for a warless world. But the optimism is that we actually have the mechanisms now to make it possible. And those mechanisms, of course, are the peace treaties and the League of Nations. On your PowerPoint slide here, you have another reason for the disgust of war is the revelations of, one, the cost of war, and then the profiteering of war. There's this real revulsion towards those who made money off war, and they feel that behind the scenes of war you have industry and powers that be that benefit from war, and so they want nothing to do with that. Well, fear and resignation. Now we move into the 30s. The appeal of pacifism and the possibility of outlawing war was put to the test as international tensions rose precipitously in the next decade. In the early 1930s, Mussolini led Italian aggression perplexed and paralyzed the League of Nations. Japanese aggression against China did likewise. Hitler's ascension to power in 1933 made a bad situation or bad situations even worse. By 1936, the Treaty of Versailles, the Locarno Pact, and the League of Nations were basically dead, impotent. It was at least impotent. It was what one author calls a dark valley, the 30s. Fear and anxiety was palpable, requiring exhortations to overcome. One of the most haunting visions, and I've already alluded to this, was that of the next war. A war which would be a catastrophe, even greater than the last, and whose only issue could be the end of this civilization. It would, quote, give a body blow to religion and morals and may mean the end of Western civilization. And again, growing visions of apocalyptic nightmares were motivation for pacifism. Yet that very pacifism, which some saw as the only way to escape catastrophe, was increasingly deemed to be irresponsible and impotent to stop predatory nations. Consequently, international tensions acted as a solvent to pacifist aspirations. And pacifism in Britain was widely abandoned over the 30s, and American pacifists were divided over whether or not some war could be justified. And that same kind of shift of views on pacifism away from pacifism can be seen in the Canadian press as well. You have contradictory voices. You have those who still, they kind of double down and, and argue there's still a need, we can still make it, we can still seek after a warless world, and so that language is there. You will have denominational resolutions published that state outright the opposition to war, and that the denominations will in no way support the next war. Here on your PowerPoint slide, you can see the United Church of Canada in 1932, 1934, 1936, 1938. Obviously, they met every 2 years. Basically said that the church will not support war as a way of resolving international relations. So that popular sentiment within the press and within the churches and coming from the pulpits makes its way into these official resolutions voted upon, and the majority supporting these resolutions. So that becomes part of the United Church's official statement on war. The BCMP, Baptist Convention of the Maritime Provinces, Baptist Convention of Ontario, Quebec, and the Baptist Union of Western Canada all have similar resolutions against supporting any type of war to solve international tensions. The Anglicans have a statement from the Church of England in Britain, and it's a similar kind of statement, but it's not a complete renunciation of using the sword ever, but it reflects the pacifism of the day. The Presbyterians do not have a statement. They move away from that. The Presbyterians are in a very different place. They've just lost 2/3 of their members. They're trying to preserve their tradition, their heritage, and their tradition and their heritage is a reformed view on church, state, and war, which is a support for the just war. And so they really are not moving away from their heritage in all kinds of ways. And one way of remaining faithful to their heritage is not moving away from it by moving towards pacifism. I published an article in the Journal of Presbyterian History on that. But these statements are they have a ring of, or a note of desperation, because the churches know, the clergy who are supportive of these denominational statements know that there's a growing call for the churches to support some kind of military action. There's growing commentary that the pacifism of the 20s and early mid-30s was irresponsible. Some letters to the editor, for instance, in various papers expressed concern over what was coined peace hysteria, arguing that unilateral disarmament was irresponsible and war under certain conditions may be necessary. And so there's that kind of commentary. And you will have, again, right up to 38 and 39, the recognition that pacifism would be the ideal, that the League of Nations must be supported, that in some way the churches must help the League of Nations accomplish its ends. But you will begin to get this commentary back saying, but if Germany can't be stopped through some kind of deal, such as what Chamberlain made, some kind of treaty, some kind of acquiescence to demand, then military force cannot be excluded from a Christian order of things. For instance, one clergyman pondering the use of military force in the Czechoslovakian crisis argued that it would seem to be coercion by physical force that cannot be excluded from a Christian order of things. But such force must be exercised in the service of the ideas which are themselves moral. And so it's a moving back to the reformed position, but it's a reformed back to the just war position, but it's reformed in that the jingoism of the past has been weeded out. The just war position becomes winnowed. That the jingoism, the harshness, the hatred, the rhetoric, the demonization of the enemy in the discourse of the churches is criticized, and there's a reluctance to go to war. And so the reluctance is there, and when war is declared, it's resignation. And there's a resigned note to them supporting the state in the war. And yeah, the churches could certainly pray. They have joint calls for prayer. The Anglicans, United Church, Presbyterians, Baptists, Salvation Army, they all call for prayer and call for peace, even leading right up to the war. Try to create some kind of moral revival that would lead to peace. But still, at the end of the day, peace was not to be the case, and war erupted in September 1939 as a result of Germany's invasion of Poland. And the church's statements on war in 1939 were widely supportive of the war effort. However, without the rancor and enthusiasm of the opening months of the First World War. The United Church of Canada, it should be noted, did have a significant number of ministers who refused to support the war effort. And so here you have a continuation of that pacifism. A number, and this is very controversial because the United Church sees itself as a nation-building denomination, the largest Protestant denomination in the land, and they take on this nation-building role. But yet here, a significant percentage of their clergy, it's 50 or 70 of them, can't remember the exact numbers, but it's a significant chunk, go public and state that the church must stick to its statements made in the 1930s that it will never support a war. And so this creates a serious division in the United Church. But the majority of United Church ministers, official statements of the United Church, and Baptists, Anglicans, and Presbyterians come out in support of the war effort. Churches shifted to a wartime footing, adjusted their ministries accordingly, but not without recognizing that they must shape the morality of the nation. And they needed to turn people to repentance in order to maintain sanity in the midst of war, but also a proper perspective in the midst of war, to move towards supporting the war, but to still try to create goodwill with all people. And so they're trying this to carry out this very careful balancing act, to support a war, but to not hate. And there's a note of recognition that those who do not support just war, who are not willing to support the war, must be treated with respect. Those Christians, quote, those Christians who in the days of war hold to their convictions of international peace, brotherhood, and goodwill, must expect to suffer not so much from the enemy as from their own countrymen. So, in other words, if you're a pacifist in Canada, you're going to suffer. People are going to treat you poorly. But they too may make some contribution towards a lasting peace, a peace built upon the will of God and the methods of God. And in the spirit of interwar pacifism, there was a call for a hate-free war, which seems awkward and it seems strange to hear that. But what they're trying to say, that Christ, this is their language, He is our peace, Jesus is our peace, and through Him we all, British, Germans, Canadians, French, Italians, Russians, Americans, Poles, Japanese, Chinese, have to access one spirit unto the Father. So here's this continuing notion of the brotherhood of man. That's their terminology. It's a counter to the hatred of the First World War, because if you study anything about the rhetoric of the First World War, you know, the demonization of the Germans, the Huns, was very harsh, even coming from the churches. And so here's this, you know, go to war but don't hate. And it's, of course, not always able to keep that ideal in mind, but it's an ideal that they keep. And that statement on human solidarity and brotherhood is a powerful demonstration of how interwar pacifism helped to reform the just war tradition. And so there's this swing to pacifism. The pacifism's dropped, but that pacifism did reform the just war tradition. And so that's important to note. Here is some rhetoric that you will see in the churches that recognizes the necessity of going to war. And it is quite harsh rhetoric. The churches aren't entirely immune to invoking some harsh rhetoric, but there's still a shift, a marked shift. Gangsters cannot be reasoned out of their insanities. Force is the only law they know. The lives and liberties of nations everywhere were threatened by the ruthless racketeer of the Rhine, so it is war. And that's a lamentation, but also a statement of necessity in the opening week of war, coming from a Baptist source in September of 1939. So that's the death of a dream. So there's incredible optimism, but that optimism dies. So in conclusion, just in the last couple minutes, what can we say about this period of optimism but also of trauma in the interwar period? Between the two world wars, the churches acted in their traditional role as nation builders, seeking to shape political views and inspire Christian engagement in the world. The range of perspectives and various genres within their papers also functioned, whether intentionally or not, as texts, important texts, rebuilding meaning in a culture and a nation traumatized by the horrors of war. Their wide-ranging poems, sermons, letters to editor, devotionals, editorials, reports on official proceedings, and political commentary provided a way for the churches to face and ultimately come to grips with the cultural trauma of the worst war in human history up to that time. But also, the discourse, the papers, the sermons, and all those various genres, ironically and unwittingly, prepared them for the next catastrophe. The churches have always had a complex relationship with the state in Canada, especially when the nation is at war. That complexity was on full display in the interwar years, and the pages of the religious press reveal a conflicted church in regard to the range of views on war. The range, fluidity, and diversity of denominational responses to war and peace during the interwar period reflects the optimism and pessimism of the age, as well as important differences in denominational trajectories and traditions. There were shared impulses for peace, as well as an internationalist vision for the role of the church in developing conditions conducive for peace. But there were also important differences among churches. Interwar pacifism had broad appeal because it was a widely diverse movement, with absolute pacifists unwilling to support any war for any reason, sharing the euphoria of outlawing war with internationalist pacifists, willing to do all they could do to end war, but not willing to renounce war as a last result. Their rhetoric and methods shared much in common, and thus initially both had wide appeal. But as war with Nazi Germany loomed, the differences among pacifists became more apparent with every German annexation, and eventually the churches resorted to the just war position and supported the war against Nazi Germany and the Axis powers.
Thank you, Professor Heath, for shedding light on the debate over traditional views about war and peace during the chaotic post-First World War years. Europe was in crisis, uncertainty and alarm for the future dominated. As you very well explained, Canadians were not immune to the uncertainty, but many grew disenchanted with notions of just war. The next podcast episode of our second season will feature Chad Martin and his research on a Canadian from Brantford, Ontario, who joined the first South African contingent in 1899 to fight overseas against the Boers. Adventure, Romance, and Blackwater Fever, The Life of Arthur Leith Ross, was initially scheduled in March 2020, but we are happy to welcome Chad Martin, who graciously accepted the idea of a do-over this coming 25 February. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.